I will start for those who have joined on time. So good morning, everybody. My name is Michelle Mulder. I'm the Executive Director for Grants, Innovation and Product Development at the SAMRC. Before I carry on, Grace, could you just indicate that you can hear me and that you can see the slides in full presentation mode? Okay, I'm assuming you can. So as I mentioned, I'm the Executive Director for Grants, Innovation and Product Development at the South African Medical Research Council. And I really want to welcome all of you to this webinar today. It forms actually a Medical Device Stakeholder Forum meeting, but obviously we have cast the net much wider. We've invited as many stakeholders as we think might be interested. And the purpose of today really is to download and present the results of a medical devices landscape analysis that we conducted over the last few years. It is in the webinar format, which means you won't be able to actually ask questions in audio, but you will be able to post questions in the Q&A section or in the chat. I will not look at any of those until I finish the presentation so that I don't get distracted. But please do reserve your questions, and we will hopefully have a follow-up session that we will organize so that we can really get more feedback and discuss the next steps and way forward after everybody's had a chance to have a look at and to read through this report. So I'm going to dive right into it. There's a lot of information. Some of that I will go through much more quickly, and some I'll spend a little bit more time on. But I will probably present for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will hopefully have some questions in the chat that we can answer after that. So my presentation will look at, talk about, first of all, the introduction and rationale, why we did the survey, how we approached it, summary of existing information that we put together, and then actual results that we obtained in the survey. The survey included a section on the impact of COVID, because obviously it happened during a time of upheaval when COVID actually had quite a substantial impact on the sector. I'll spend a little bit of time on the analysis and conclusions, and then very briefly talk about our recommendations and way forward. So what was the rationale? So, I mean, I think we all widely recognize that the medical devices industry in South Africa can contribute more significantly to not just economic growth, but job creation, and of course, enhanced health outcomes and improved quality of life if we can get more life-saving products out there. And there are a number of stakeholders in South Africa, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this is certainly the list of stakeholders that we consulted with. And these stakeholders all have a shared vision to grow a vibrant medical device innovation and manufacturing ecosystem in South Africa. So some of them are obviously the Industry Association, SAMRC and MDMSA, government departments like the DTIC and the Department of Science and Innovation, obviously the MRC, CSIR, Technology Innovation Agency. And then this last one is the Global Health Innovation Accelerator. And this is a partnership between the MRC and PATH. It's hosted at the MRC, and it's really aimed at developing and implementing at scale global health technologies to improve health outcomes. And this is really our rationale for conducting the survey. As GEAR, we need to be able to develop and implement and take products seamlessly through the innovation pipeline, particularly medical devices. And for that, we need to know that there is a pipeline. We need to know who to go to, where the capabilities are, etc. So to be able to build a sector, we really needed to have a better understanding of the size, characteristics, and dynamics of the sector. So we do know that there's a number of previous reports that have been done on the medical devices sector in South Africa. Some of these were really quite comprehensive, but they are now mostly out of date. They happened between 2008 and around 2014, a few that were updated more recently. But the recent reports are really the large industry reports by organizations such as Fitch Solutions and BMI, and they focus very heavily on industry statistics and the market size, which is obviously important to stakeholders. But what we wanted to look at really was, and what was lacking in these reports was, what are the actual manufacturing capabilities that exist in South Africa? What is the extent of R&D and collaboration within the manufacturing sector, but also in the innovation sector? And what does this innovation sector look like? And where are there any linkages, and are these working optimally? So we undertook the current survey so that we could fill in the identified gaps to better understand the size, characteristics, and dynamics of the market and the sector as a whole, to acquire information on actual capabilities, expertise, and capacity, and to really look at any gaps and barriers that needed to be addressed so that we can operate in a well-oiled machine and a sector that's operating optimally. So the aims of the study, again, improve our understanding of local capabilities and capacity, identify barriers and challenges, which then we can try and go about addressing, identify the actual mechanisms to address these barriers, and that will obviously now happen after the survey, and then look at opportunities to facilitate cooperation and improve linkages between the various stakeholders. So what approach did we take? So if you look at the scope of the survey, we've limited it to medical devices as defined in the Medicines and Related Substances Act, and this includes in vitro diagnostics. But we did specifically exclude those medical devices we thought were borderline, such as fitness products and the digital health applications. We had three main groups of stakeholders: medical device manufacturers, the innovation sector, being the higher education institutions and science councils, and then the service providers and support agencies. And we had different information we gathered from each of those. And then, of course, the geographic scope, we limited it to South Africa. So we took a four-phased approach, and we're just finishing phase 3 now. In phase 1, we looked at the existing reports on medical devices sector in South Africa. We did a desktop study on that, as well as gathering information on who the stakeholders are. We did a lot of stakeholder consultation with those I mentioned earlier around what the needs were, what kind of information we should be gathering, and the gaps in existing information. We developed various stakeholder databases from a number of different sources. During phase 2, we designed different questionnaires for the different stakeholder groups. We piloted these. We then conducted the survey itself, and then did data entry and cleanup, and of course analysis. And that analysis has now gone into a report, which has been some time in the making, but we finally have completed that. And that's what I'm reporting on today. So that's the output number 1, is the survey report. It will be made available to all stakeholders, hopefully from tomorrow on our website, and I will send links out for that. And then the second output is a stakeholder database. So we have obviously a database now of all of those that we have, the information we've collected. And we are actually working with the CSIR to put this onto an online portal, which is the Innovation Bridge portal, a national platform that showcases innovation. So we will have a dedicated medical devices a section within Innovation Bridge that will include the specific information on the medical devices sector. And of course, the output, another output of the survey in phase 4 really needs to be, what do we do with this information? How do we take it forward? How do we harness what's the strengths and opportunities, and how do we address the threats and weaknesses? So the survey itself, we identified 136 medical device manufacturers in total. Of these, 66 completed the full survey, 71 completed just section A. So we do have some limited information on a few more stakeholders. So that was around a 49% response rate. And despite substantial follow-ups, we were not able to increase that, unfortunately. In terms of medical device innovators, we targeted all the higher education institutions that are active in research, and around 17 of those responded, but 2 of them indicated no activity in the medical devices space. So the results are reported off of 15 different higher education institutions. We approached 5 different science councils that were active in research and that we felt were likely to be working in the medical devices space. And all of them completed the survey, so we had 100% response rate there. We didn't focus substantially on the support companies, and in the end we only surveyed 10 of them, but we did approach a few more and got just under half, a 46% response rate. In terms of the analysis, we used the technological innovation systems approach to analyze the results. I'm not going to go into detail, it is listed in the report, but we also looked at it from an ecosystem and product development value chain point of view as well, and that's how I'll report the final overall results. So the first step, as I mentioned, was to synthesize existing information. We looked at 9 existing reports that were published between that should be 2008 and 2021. These are the reports that are listed. And so what we did was the first section of the landscape analysis report gives a summary of what information can be gleaned from those reports. So this is really historical information, although some of it is up to 2021, particularly the trade statistics that have come out of the Fitch Solutions report. So what it has shown in terms of the demand, so what is the overall market size in South Africa for medical devices, is that South Africa is one of the largest medical device markets in the Middle East and African region. It was estimated at about 21 billion in 2021 and projected to grow to about close to 30 billion by 2025. We are within the region one of the most attractive markets, but we still only make up about 0.3% of the global market. So really very, very small. The medical devices market in this country is very diverse, ranging from consumables to major capital items. And there is a focus on reliable, low maintenance products, but also an growing interest in the more high-tech equipment. So we obviously have a public and a private sector market in South Africa. The public sector market is probably the largest. Government is the major purchaser of healthcare equipment, as we know, given the size of the public health sector itself, healthcare sector, with close to 8,000 health facilities and more than 85,000 registered beds. However, this market is characterized by price sensitivity. It's very much tender-based. And of course, there are a lot of issues that have been cited around public procurement, being slow, slow payments, etc. And also there's severe price constraints within the public sector, which obviously affect the market. In the private sector is also substantial, but around 524 facilities and about 40,000 beds. Also operates under significant cost pressure. The medical schemes are major players and do influence the prices, and not yet, or as of 2017, had not yet included medical devices in the prescribed minimum benefits. So this is a very busy diagram, but it really sums up the medical device market in 2019 in terms of the actual product areas. You can see that the other medical devices sector makes up around 38% of the market, followed by consumables around 19%, and then diagnostic imaging, etc. And obviously these are all broken down into specific types of medical devices. If we look at the domestic manufacture, this graph on the left shows these trends in domestic manufacture of medical devices in different product categories up until 2019. So there obviously has been a slight increase, and it's sitting at around just over $200 million in terms of manufacturing output, of which more than half is exported. This middle diagram is very small, but it's really just to illustrate that if you look at the green bars, which are the size of the domestic market for these different products, and the blue bars on the left are the actual manufacturing output, you can see that the output in South Africa is not really going to make too much of a dent in what the actual demand is. And also to mention that most of this, a lot of this output is exported, so not much goes into the local market. So more than 76% of these devices are being imported. And this makes up, the current estimate is around 90% of the value. So a real dominance of imports in the country. If you look at the local companies, and again, this comes from those previous reports, they reported around 250 to 600 different suppliers. Each report looked at different sort of market segments, so the numbers do vary substantially. But you can see just in the diagram on the right, mostly dominated by those who are importers or combination importers and manufacturers. Only about 21% were pure manufacturers. And the local suppliers are dominated by multinationals, but there's a high degree of fragmentation and competition. So if we look at exports, you can see on the left again this huge disparity and trade imbalance. So the red bars represent the imports, the blue bars exports, and the grey bars show what the deficit is between these. So obviously, again, big dominance of imports into the local medical devices market. And these are the exports by product area, so obviously mostly in the other medical devices space, and then followed by consumables. Our main export destinations in 2019 are illustrated here. So the purple bars are African countries, the blue bars are European countries, and then the other colors are other destinations. So you'll see most of them are to African countries and then to Europe. And this is again from 2019, but remember that so this doesn't necessarily represent the manufacturing output, which then gets exported. A lot of these exports are actually re-exports. So companies in South Africa who are importing products in and then re-exporting them because obviously we use as a springboard into Africa. If we look at imports, the local industry is, as I mentioned, is dominated by imports, valued at about 11 billion in 2013 and grown to 18 billion in about 2019. And most of these are, more than 76% are imported by multinational companies. And again, these are the leading sources of medical device imports, mostly from the US, and then followed by Germany and China, and then the European Union. And the product areas show similar trends. So mostly other medical devices, followed by consumables, and then the rest. In terms of regulation, I think we all know that in the past, medical devices in South Africa were not specifically regulated by local regulations, although in many cases CE marks and other registration was required. But we also know that in 2015, there were amendments to the Medicines and Related Substances Act, which has changed the whole system completely. So this has introduced this 4-tier risk-based licensing and registration system. And it applies to all companies in South Africa that manufacture, sell, import, export, distribute, and wholesale medical devices. It also provides procedures and provisions for device registration and requirements, so the actual devices themselves. And it provided for the establishment of SAMRC to replace the Medicines Control Council. So the first step these regulations and amendments are being implemented in a phased approach. The first step being call up of medical device establishments. And at the moment, after this grace period has been completed and time has been allowed for people to register, we are now at a stage where no medical device may be manufactured, distributed, imported, exported, or sold without a valid SAMRC establishment license. There is an exemption for non-sterile, non-measuring Class A medical devices. And there is a grace period for requiring ISO 13485 certification, but with establishment, there needs to be some declaration of quality management in place. So the next step or phase of the implementation of these regulations will be call up of specific devices, which is a very huge task if you think about the sheer number of medical devices that are sold and used in South Africa. And until then, licensing of specific devices is based on an attestation and checklist model. So with your establishment license, obviously a product list is provided. And for devices and IVDs in the classes B, C, and D, it does require, it does use reliance pathways in other jurisdictions. So if those products are registered in other jurisdictions, they can be approved to be included on the lists for medical device establishments. Obviously, this will all change once the call up of actual medical devices starts. So this is an overview in terms of R&D. There was some reporting in the previous reports on R&D expenditure. It was just quite limited, but what it did show is that R&D expenditure in South Africa is very low, less than 1% of turnover, and possibly as low as 0.5%. It was hard to actually get those figures compared to a global average of around 6.8%. So we really are sitting very low in terms of investment in R&D. But we do have a number of different funding instruments that are available, and those are just illustrated here across the value chain, and they're described in more detail in the report. So getting on to the survey results. So this is the information we know from what's been done already. So we wanted to gather the fresh information that was slightly different and had a slightly different focus. And so I'm going to report the results according to those 3 different sectors. The biggest sector that we surveyed obviously was the medical device manufacturers. So this is an overview of the sector characteristics in terms of location and age. We can see that most of the companies are located in Gauteng, followed by the Western Cape, and then KwaZulu-Natal, with a small number of companies with registration addresses in the Eastern Cape. In terms of age, so this is plotted by date of establishment. You can see the trend, particularly from 2004, a declining trend of new company formation. So this is a little bit worrying, not just so a decline in company formation, but also you know, the longevity of these companies and you know, their ability to sustain and to maintain economic feasibility within the economic climate. So that is something that does need to be looked at. In terms of size, most of the companies are classified as small. If you look at the number of permanent staff and you look at the turnover, so you will see, just to mention, in terms of casual employment, we did have this smallest category as 0 to 10. So it's quite possible that most of these in the 59 of these 59 companies actually have no temporary employees. But if we look at permanent employees, most of them are employ 50 or less staff, and most fall within the 50 million rand or less turnover, if we look at this. So definitely dominated by smaller companies. Of those respondents, 80% of them indicated that almost all, or at least 90% of their turnover was due to medical devices. So we definitely did focus on the medical device sector here. But there are other companies that have that will be involved in medical device manufacturing and maybe have a much smaller proportion of their business that is dedicated to medical devices. In terms of BEE status, you can see that around 62% of respondents have a triple BEE level of between 1 and 4, but 28% are deemed non-compliant or exempt, either due to having a small enough turnover or a small enough size. If we look at them by size, you can see that just over half of the larger companies and around 63% of the smaller companies are rated at level 4 or above, which is actually quite encouraging, because obviously triple BEE level status is very important when it comes to trading, particularly in the public sector in South Africa, but also in the private sector. In terms of product areas for local medical device manufacturers, this is just an illustration of the main product areas by proportion and the classes in which they operate. And on the right is the sort of a breakdown of the main product categories, dominated by consumables, followed by orthopedics and prosthetics, and then of course the other medical device category, which has not been broken down, but is broken down in the report itself. If we look at product areas and classes, sorry, this should actually read in the green, should read class C. but dominance really of consumables and Class A category products. If we look at the market, sorry, there's actually a graph. Oh, there we are. Graph missing. So this, these diagrams are really around which are the main markets into which the medical device manufacturers are selling. So on the left, you will see that they are mostly selling into the private sector domestically, but also into the private sector internationally, followed by public sector, domestic, and then international, and a few are selling into the aid agencies. And this is really just another way of illustrating this, looking at the percentage revenue of the from the different market sectors. So overall then, the domestic private sector market is obviously the most important, followed by the domestic public sector. And 69% derive less than 25% of their revenue from exports, but 15 companies focus exclusively on the SA market. So although there is a lot of export, there are also a number of companies that are focused specifically in South Africa. If we look at the main markets that they sell into, so what we asked them to do was for each of these regions was to rank which ones were the most important, and that's what the different colors are representing the bars. The main markets clearly for medical device manufacturers in South Africa are in Africa, followed by Europe and the Middle East. When we looked at export readiness, it was encouraging to see that around 68% of companies are actually already export ready. Only 10% were not. Only 10% required assistance with getting export ready. So it seems that export readiness itself is not necessarily a huge requirement, but if we look at the comments that came out around challenges and barriers, there were a lot of issues and suggestions around how to increase exports and how companies could be assisted with this. If we look at manufacturing capabilities, on the left are the in-house capabilities, on the right, the outsourced. So mostly product design and product manufacturing packaging are happening in-house, and the main things that are outsourced are really sterilization and repackaging, etc. But there are some that outsource things like product design and components of the product manufacture. Again, this is a busy slide, but it just sums up the main capabilities within the medical device manufacturers. We can see that component assembly is the most frequently cited capability, followed by OEM manufacture and material component testing. And the highest capability is in machining, followed by the plastics area and chemicals. 44%, so just less than half of the respondents had access to clean room facilities. A number did not, and then there were about 9% who didn't comment on this. If we look at current capacity and potential for expansion, most of the companies, so around 60%, only use one shift. A small number use 2 shifts, and a very small number use 3 shifts. So clearly there's a lot more capacity that can be used, and particularly if we look at the actual current utilization. So close to 60% are only using between 25 and 75% of their manufacturing capacity. And 79% actually indicated that they could increase production by around 40% or more. So I think the bottom line here, what this illustrates, is that the manufacturing capacity that we have sitting in the country is currently underutilized, and there really is an opportunity to maximize this, add new product lines, increase manufacture of existing product lines, provided that there is a market for them. We also looked at registration or certification of companies. So those who had quality management systems in place, you can see most of them focus on ISO 13485, which is not surprising. 51% have those in place already, and 24% are in the process of doing that. So by the end, you know, we're probably looking at about 75% who will have ISO 13485 or very close to it. Obviously, the requirement in future for SAMRC registration will be that you have the ISO 13485. So it means that a number of the companies, around 25% odd, will still have to really get into gear and get that certification in place. So 79% of the companies are registered with SAMRC, which is a little worrying for the other 21% who should not actually be selling at this point, or manufacturing if they're not SAMRC registered. So the second most widely used system, quality management system, is ISO 9001, followed by this the US one, the 21 CFR 820. But very few companies, I think, are focusing on that. So over 50% of them indicated that they had obtained product registration, certification, or approval, with a further third of them in progress. So on the right is the product registration, certification, and approval. And these are just some of the certifications that are listed. I think there was some confusion with this. For those who've registered, listed SAMRC, for example, the product may be included on the SAMRC, on the Medical Device Establishment License product list. However, SAMRC, as we know, is not yet registered, called up individual devices for registration. So that when that does happen, obviously that bar will increase substantially. But what is encouraging is the number who have received CE marks or FD certification for products. We also looked at other general ISO facility classification, and around 60% have none. And then the others focus mainly on ISO 7 and ISO 8. Importantly, about 3/4 of respondents indicated that they require assistance with regulatory and compliance. It was, I think, one of the number one issues that was cited by the medical device, in fact, all stakeholders. If we look at research and development, and R&D spend as a percentage of revenue, there's a large number who do know R&D, who do R&D but reported no actual expenditure, and I'll mention why in a minute. But just to mention that for companies in the SEV, it was quite difficult for them to actually quantify R&D expenditure because it tends to fluctuate. So in some years, you might need a little bit of extra money put into developing a process or optimizing a process or developing a new product. And in other years, nothing will be required. So it's hard to pin down a sort of trend or an actual number. But for those who did report, we can see that overall, as we found with the from the other surveys, the other reports, R&D expenditure as a proportion of turnover in South Africa is still very, very low, particularly according to when you compare to global standards. About 51% spend less than 5% of their turnover on R&D, and as I mentioned, 33% spend naught, even though they do report that they do R&D. And this is because, if you look at this last bullet, R&D is either funded externally, it's conducted by collaborators and partners, but it's also not necessarily a key focus for medical device manufacturers. If we look at the R&D expenditure relative to turnover, you'll see that 5 of the companies that spend more than, so those that are more R&D intensive and spending more than 20% of their revenue on R&D are the small companies. These are generally startups, often not actually with a product in the market yet, and those are, they're the small high-tech startups. But there are a couple of much larger companies who, for example, there's 2 with revenues of more than 50 million that are spending more than 20% of their revenue on R&D. In terms of sourcing external funding for R&D, if you look on the left, this is the number who have applied for R&D rebate applications. Only 4 of the companies that responded to this particular question have applied for an R&D tax rebate. And the encouraging thing is that all 4 of them were successful. But this represents only 9% of those who actually declared that they were doing R&D. So it's a very small percentage, and it's clearly not being optimally used. The R&D rebate does allow a 150% tax rebate on R&D expenditure, so it is a useful tool. And the main reasons that companies cited for not applying or for not applying was either they were unaware of this instrument, but mostly they thought it was too bureaucratic. They didn't think they were going to be compliant or were going to be, that it was worth applying and that they were going to be successful. which is, I think, something that really can be addressed. And then in terms of sourcing funding for R&D from other sources, again, a fairly small number, 23 have applied for government R&D funding. And the encouraging thing is that 74% of these were successful. But again, there were issues that were cited around excessive bureaucracy, not feeling that they wouldn't necessarily comply with the funding requirements, etc. So I do think those public funding instruments could be much better utilized by these companies. If we look at collaborations with STI institutions, the 48% of companies collaborate with STI institutions locally and abroad in 48 separate collaborations over the past 5 years. So that is actually a fair number. And 41% of them also collaborate with industry. So it showed similar trends in terms of collaborating with STI institutions versus industry. This graph gives a breakdown of where those main collaborators are, and you can see mostly with local institutions and dominated by the big universities like UCT, Stellenbosch, and then of course the CSIR. 11 of the companies indicated that they had co-developed products or co-licensed products with research institutions. Most of these with South African, 1 international, and 2 with both national and international. Those who responded indicated an interest in collaborating. So although there might be a small percentage that are currently collaborating, quite a number of companies expressed an interest in collaborating with R&D institutions. So it was sort of just less than, sorry, there were only 23% who were not interested. And three additional 3% who felt that there was too much bureaucracy and trust issues. But there were 53% that were interested and another 20% that were conditionally interested. So quite a lot of interest, and I think a lot of pairing that can be done to address that. There were also a number, more than 50% that were interested in manufacturing innovations coming out of STI institutions, and interested in collaborating with these institutions to be able to develop their own products. So really, I think a scope for much larger, more extensive collaboration between academia and industry, given the interest that has been expressed. If we look at industry association membership, mostly, so there's about just less than half of the companies had no association with or no membership of an industry association, but those that did were mostly with MDMSA and SAMRC, and then some the Western Cape Medical Devices Cluster. If we look at interest, so those who were already members are listed here, but there was a number that are 58% are actually interested. So there's a real uncaptured market out there still, and this the colors in this bar are the different provinces. So what it also indicates is that there's real scope to grow the Western Cape Medical Device Cluster and potentially develop clusters in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And then finally, on this support on the MDMs, the medical device manufacturers, support services utilized. A number of them do use these different support services, mostly consultants. And many have an interest in using different support services, and a lot express an interest in having an online portal. Again, regulatory compliance is one of the main needs that were expressed in terms of support. So moving on to the STI institutions, most of them are located again in Gauteng and the Western Cape. A number actually in the Eastern Cape. So all of the institutions in the Eastern Cape were indicated that they were doing some medical device R&D, although it was quite limited. These are just a breakdown by the types of institutions. So we looked at universities of technology and science councils. And we focused on science councils that were research performing. And most of these institutions have in-house capability for research, innovation, product development, and clinical and other types of studies. If we look at the technology, so we asked these institutions to let us know how many projects or technologies that their researchers had disclosed to them in the past 10 years, or that they were working on as a tech transfer office. And you can see that most of these were very small. So 3/4 of the institutions surveyed had between 9 and 5, or let's say between 1 and 5 technologies that they were working on that were around medical devices. But there were a number of institutions that were working on more than 5 different medical device products. So there are these pockets of excellence and greater capacity. And again, if you look at the number of technologies disclosed to the TTO over the last 10 years, mostly very small numbers for the different institutions. If we look at the outputs, this illustrates the patent families, the products in the market, and the successful spin-outs. A lot of the companies the institutions indicated none, but there were some institutions that are obviously operating in this space and actually have filed patents, have got products into the market, and even successful spin-outs. And again, a very small number of pockets of excellence, institutions that have more than 5 successful spin-outs, more than 5 products in the market, and more than 20 patent families. Interestingly, we did if we tallied up the numbers from the different responses, there were 82 different patent families granted and or pending on medical device technologies, which is quite a lot. However, we do think some of these are not necessarily strictly medical devices. So some of them, for example, were on biomarkers, which could be applied on diagnostics, but they weren't necessarily specifically around a medical device. And then there were, if you look at the patent families and licenses and assignments. Again, this is just the breakdown by institution, the number of institutions, and the IP rights licensed and assigned. This is illustrated in the next slide. There were 35 altogether licenses or assignments that were reported. So I'm just trying to move my bars around so I can see the text. Over the last 10 years, so around 18 spin-outs, this is licensing and assignment of medical device technologies to companies. Of these, 18 were to spin-outs, 12 were to local companies, and 5 were to international companies. And then if you look at the number of spin-outs that are currently trading, it's encouraging to see quite a lot. Dominated by those emanating from UCT and Stellenbosch, but also TUT and others. So that is encouraging, but still not a massive number of spin-outs that are specific around medical devices. And this is just really illustrates the geographic spread of these R&D and innovation outputs. Again, a focus on the Western Cape and Gauteng, which is not surprising given which institutions are in those provinces and the R&D intensity in those provinces. If we look at innovation partnerships, most of the STI institutions are partnering with either with local partners, some with both local and international, and some with just international. And then we have quite a lot, 40% that have got no partners at all when it comes to medical device innovation. And in terms of what these partnerships look like, some of them are for supervising students, most are for contract research and for other. And the report does break down that other category. We look at funding and support services. A number of these institutions do apply for public and other funding for R&D, specifically for medical devices within the institutions. The main funders would be TIER and other, and then followed by the MRC. So these are sort of public instruments, and then SAB's South African Breweries Foundation, and then there's a number of others that are specifically listed. But I think the bottom line is that the universities and science councils are finding external funding for medical device innovation, but I still don't think this is optimal. And again, that came out in the general discussion from the universities. If we look at external support services, in fact, just less than half of the institutions actually use these, but where they do, they usually use consultants. And in many cases, they actually use the universities of technologies, particularly for rapid prototyping and tooling services. And then finally, the support services, this was really not a major focus of this survey, so it is quite limited in scope. We only really ended up surveying 10 companies, 7 of them that provide sort of more technical services and 3 that provide funding. And this is just a breakdown of the areas in which services are provided. Because, as I mentioned earlier, because of when the survey was conducted, and as we were starting to analyze the results, COVID hit, which of course impacted substantially on getting the survey completed and out. But what it did was it added a whole new complexity and information. Because the medical devices sector was substantially impacted both positively and negatively by COVID. We know that there were shortages of testing reagents, diagnostic kits, PPE, devices, etc., particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. And what it did reveal, so it revealed that we had these deficiencies in domestic supply, and this obviously the danger of relying on imports. But it did reveal the potential of this emergent collaborative model and showed that we could develop and manufacture products at short notice, that we could harness the funding for this from a number of different and non-traditional sources, and that we could work together, bringing all sectors, academia, government, industry, civil society, to get products developed and out there as soon as possible. The report does highlight a few specific initiatives that are related to medical devices, and it's not exhaustive, so apologies if we did leave any of those out. But some of those that are highlighted are the National Ventilator Project, the South African Solidarity Fund, SPIRE, the South African Pandemic Intervention and Relief Effort Fund, and then the investments that we made as the MRC with DSI and TIER in local diagnostics for COVID. And you can read more about those in the report. There was also an add-on survey that was conducted by Harry Tuffel and Tony Bunn under MDMSA and the MRC. And this really looked at what the impact was of COVID on medical device manufacturers. It had a number of leading questions that they had to respond yes, no, yes or no to. And these are really the responses. So, I mean, what it really is, I'm not going to go through it, but what it illustrates is that the respondents largely agreed with what was being posed around things that, things like COVID showed that we have capability, but it needs to be improved, that you need to work with more partners, it needs better alignment, etc. So just then, so that really is the end of the results and the information that we gathered. So what do we do with this? This is really, I know it's a very busy slide, but it summarizes really what the landscape looks like, and it looks at it from a value chain point of view. So if you look from early discovery all the way down to the market, you've got the main sectors being academia, industry, government and supports, and then of course the market itself. So what we know is in the public sector overall, we have 11 universities, 4 universities of technology and 5 science councils that are active in medical device innovation. They have capabilities across the value chain. Many of these are only have minuscule involvement, so 1 or 2 projects, but we do have a few like Stellenbosch, UCT and CSIR that are major contributors, have a number of, quite a lot of critical mass, not just in medical device development, but in outputs, spin-outs, patents, etc. I mentioned the 82 patent families, 35 different IP transactions in the last 10 years, mostly to spin-out companies, but also to international companies and some to local companies. We do have around 60% of these that partner with industry, and we've got 20 successful medical device spin-out companies from 8 different institutions to date from the count that came from the survey. If we look at the manufacturers, we've got at least 136 MDM medical device manufacturers, which are mostly in Gauteng, Western Cape, and KwaZulu-Natal. I do think that number might have increased because I know of a number of companies that have been established in the last year or two. So I think if we updated that, that number would go up. Around half of them manufacture consumables, predominantly Class A, but we do have a number that are, or small number that are working in the high-tech space, looking at real sophisticated and high-value equipment. The capabilities predominantly in component assembly and testing, OEM manufacture, machining and injection molding. We did notice this decline in company formation since 2014, but as I say, I do believe that there have been a number of new companies established in the last couple of years. Around 77% are active in R&D, but most of these spend less than 5% of their turnover on R&D, and there's a large proportion who actually spend no internal funds on R&D. But there are sort of pockets of R&D intensity, and that's with the small, young and high-tech startups. Again, focused in the Western Cape and Gauteng. Around 40% collaborating with industry, which is encouraging, and around 48% collaborating with STIs locally. But the interest expressed in this is obviously much larger, so there is scope to increase that collaboration. A large number are compliant now with SARPA registration, and many are getting into compliance with ISO 13485. A number have CE marks for their products and FDA certification, but there are still a number of products that are currently unregistered in other jurisdictions. We have good membership of MDMSA and SAMED, but still really quite low overall. If we look at, it's less than 50%. So again, real potential to expand participation and membership of these industry associations and regional clusters. Overall, around $200 million US dollars in terms of manufacturing output. Most of that is exported, and we know that manufacturing capacity can be increased because it's currently underutilized. We also know the primary markets are domestic private sector and then domestic public sector. And more than 50% of the medical devices manufactured here are exported. And then there is a list of the support structures available. And then in the market itself, we know that it's estimated about 21 billion, but again, about 90% of that value is provided by imports. And then this slide I'm not going to go through, but it summarizes the remaining barriers and gaps, again, across the value chain and for the different sectors. I mean, the bottom line is that there is a lack of funding. The regulatory is a major issue. There's misalignment or not enough alignment between the different players. It's not optimally networked for collaboration. There's this lack of synergy and synchronization. And there's also, I think, it came out quite strongly that there needs to be much more government support and cohesion around policy and regulatory around the sector and supporting it. So although this survey has its limitations, it has added to our existing understanding of innovation and manufacturing ecosystem in South Africa. It's certainly reaffirmed and added to the previous knowledge base around the key gaps and barriers. So these barriers are not new. They've been reported as early as 2008, and they remain. And overall, the survey has revealed that we have activities in each of the major product lifecycle stages, but these are not currently well aligned. We have the necessary role players from academia all the way down to industry and government support structures to enable end-to-end manufacture, but they're not suitably networked for optimal outcomes. We do have sophisticated processing, tooling expertise, competent role players, etc., but they are hampered by a number of barriers that remain within the sector. We do have access to digital collaboration technologies like product lifecycle management, etc., but these are not optimally used. And although there is funding available, this is not enough, and it's also not optimally used or necessarily optimally dispersed and offered. So just to finish off then, I mean, this is just a very high level. We do provide in the report a number of different recommendations, again, by sector, focusing on different aspects from R&D all the way down to the market, and how we can address some of these gaps and challenges. And then I just want to finish off by acknowledging all of those who contributed. I haven't put individual names here, but in terms of the organizations involved, these were all of the organizations that we consulted with, that gave inputs along the way, and participated in the initial design of this survey. The survey was funded by a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the Global Health Innovation Accelerator, or GEAR, which sits within the MRC. So the survey was led by the MRC team with support from these other organizations and other individuals. I do particularly want to acknowledge Lawrence Clitty, who's an independent consultant who really pulled everything together for us. He did substantial analyses of the data, got the report into shape, generated a number of the most of the figures, and and really got the report to where it is today. And then, of course, there were a number of individuals who are listed in the report who also assisted with the drafting, the review of the report, etc. And so I will stop there, and thank you all very much. I know I have gone a little bit over time, so I'll just quickly look then at I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see the questions and chat. Instrument processing chemicals. So I'll just have to look at that. So we looked at it from different the manufacturing capability from different angles. So there was the type of capability, whether it's machining, etc. And then we looked at the material inputs. I just didn't actually present on the, we do have results of that in the survey, but I didn't present on the material inputs. I hope that answers that question. R&D, so we defined R&D in terms of the Frascati manual, which in our view would include testing of products. The question is whether the companies themselves utilize that criteria in responding to the question on R&D. Sterilizers, yeah, I don't have the details of specifically what the sterilizers are, but they would be, so if you look at the definition of medical devices, it does include devices that sterilize medical devices, and I think it is probably stipulated in more detail there. The next question is, would DTIC or SAR provide support or funding to help those companies achieve ISO certification? So there are some mechanisms in place. I don't think SARPA is in the business of providing funding to companies. They obviously, as the regulator, I think should probably not be playing that role, although they can certainly provide guidance and training. But there are other support mechanisms available for regulatory, and again, you can view those in the report. But I think one of the key recommendations that does need to come out of this is we need to set up new mechanisms, additional incentives, additional funding mechanisms, but also the softer support for regulation and certification. A question on the overall compound annual growth rate for the pharma sector. We didn't survey the pharma sector, so I don't have that on hand. Some medical devices not well defined by SARPRA. Okay, thanks for that comment. So we went with the classifications used in the trade data in terms of the way we asked the questions for our stakeholders. So again, I hope that when you read the survey that would answer that question, Duncan, around how these are defined. I see there's no focus on oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide production. Sorry, this. Of the human body, is this due to lack of understanding of South Africa? So yeah, we didn't focus on specific areas, but those would fall under some of the device categories that were included in the survey. Recommendation on how local manufacturing capacity can be utilized or how to increase demand. So I think the first thing is to increase demand. If there is a demand, I think there's obviously a huge incentive for companies to invest in increasing their capacity or increasing the utilization of their capacity. you know, with MeDDIC, for example, MeDDIC is the Medical Devices and Diagnostic Innovation Cluster Program, which is hosted within GEAR. One of the things we're doing now is we're starting to field requests from overseas for manufacturers looking for local companies to do tech transfers into. And there's one, in fact, that we are working with at the moment who want to manufacture or at least assemble and package their diagnostic kits for COVID in South Africa. So we're currently engaging with companies around that. But those are the types of things, you know, increasing the number of products that are developed and implemented, but also looking at internal tech, intramural tech transfers, inter-country tech transfers to increase local or utilization of local manufacturing capacity. So the companies that we surveyed all have an address or registered address in South Africa. So that's to answer that question. And then, so that was the questions in the Q&A, and then in the chat. Yes, the presentation will be made available, and so will the report. I'm sorry, this question is quite long. There's a few longer questions here. I think we have run out of time, and I'm a bit worried that our webinar is just going to expire and we're going to all be cut off. So I think if we may reserve answering the remainder of the questions. I think there's one or two in the chat box that have not been answered. Let me hope that when you read the report, some of those may be answered. If not, as I mentioned, we would like to have an additional feedback session. So probably the next Medical Device Stakeholder Forum will be an opportunity to feedback once everyone's had a chance to read and digest the reports, to give input and to really talk about how we take this forward. This is also being done within the working groups of the Health Tech Sector Master Plan, which is an ongoing process at the moment. So it is happening through those channels as well. As I mentioned, we are hoping to have the PDF version of the report available on our website by tomorrow afternoon. So if you go to, what we will do is, in fact, all of those who registered for the seminar, we will send the link out to all of you with the presentation. And then you'll be able to go to the website and download the link. But it'll be on the MeDDIC website. And I'm sorry I didn't include it in the presentation, but I will before I send it out to everyone. So I think the last thank you I want to give to is my team at the MRC, Earl Prinsloo, Zanzele Ndlovu, Anna Casanova is not with us here anymore, Tony Bunn, Grace Beloy, I hope I'm not left anybody out, Boipelo Sebesho, who really did the legwork in terms of gathering the data, conducting the survey, Marlon Surf, who did some of the analyses for us, and then I mentioned Lawrence Klitty, who really pulled everything together for us. So thank you to them, to our funders, to the other stakeholders who provided input, and thank you very much for your interest today. I hope it has been useful. And we look forward to your feedback and hope that you enjoy reading the reports. And I think maybe my last message is now that this is out, I think it's time to start working on the next one. And we'll talk to the DTIC and other stakeholders as to who best should undertake that and what it should look like. But I think it's very important to have this information on the sector available at our fingertips so that we know exactly what we need to do to build the sector going forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending, for sticking it out for an hour, and wish you a very good day further. Thank you.